Hello and welcome to Paul on Politics. Now, by any measure, 2016 has been an extraordinary year in politics, both domestically and abroad. It has, of course, been dominated by the B word. No, we don't mean the sequin and spray-tanned balls, but Brexit and the historic referendum result. So where has 12 months of tumult in which the only predictable thing in politics has been the unpredictable left the parties? And how might they fare in Kent in 2017? With me on the Strictly Come Politics judging panel are Professor Tim Luckhurst of the Centre for Journalism at the University of Kent and Bob Bounds, editor of the Medway Messenger. Thanks to both of them for joining us. But before we get too deep into what happened in 2016 and look ahead to 2017, Duarte Diaz reminds us of the major political events of the year.
If there's one thing we can all agree on is that politics this year got a bit crazy. For the second time, Britain took to the polls to decide on its membership on the European Union with a referendum. The Leave campaign warned us about Britain's breaking point and other dangers of staying in the Union. The now infamous campaign bus promised £350 million a week for the NHS if Britain voted to leave. Meanwhile, the Better In campaign hoped the fear of post-Brexit economic disaster would convince people to vote Remain.
I need European business, I need European goodwill, and I need European customers.
And even Barack Obama pitched in. For about 3 months, both sides battled it out on the road, in the press, and even on the River Thames. But it all came down to that one day, the 23rd of June, when Britain voted to leave the EU. For Nigel Farage and his campaign, it was Independence Day. For those in favour of the EU, disappointment. David Cameron abandoned ship by stepping down as Prime Minister, so it was up to the Conservative Party to choose a new one. It wasn't an easy job description, having to begin the Brexit negotiations, but Theresa May was up for the challenge. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage claimed victory and then resigned as leader of UKIP, saying his job was done. Or so he thought. His replacement Diana James quit after only 18 days, which put Farage back on the leadership. It wasn't until November that Paul Nuttall took the reins of UKIP. On the Labour side, Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was seriously questioned when his party held a vote of no confidence against him. But the leader of the party held his ground and managed to survive another leadership election. In the background, the Green Party also changed their leadership and the Lib Dems managed to win back a seat in the Commons. Across the pond, the United States stunned the world by electing Donald Trump as their president, and our very own Nigel Farage made sure he was there to endorse the result. While 2016 is not over just yet, we can hope the holidays bring some peace to politics.
Well, before we started the show, we asked both our guests to sum up in one word what they thought of 2016 in politics. So, Tim, show us your one word. Populism. Now, what struck most people this year has probably been the fact that there's been a kind of anti-establishment revolt. Is there anything more complicated going on than that?
I think there are lots of very complicated things going on, Paul, most of which have got to do with people feeling profound economic hardship. But there has been a revolt against the establishment. There's been a revolt against people who have promised a great deal and failed to deliver an awful lot of it. I think the astounding thing about 2016 is that people have ended it by voting for people who've promised even more and almost certainly can't deliver what they've promised. And that's what I mean by populism. People being fooled by populist promises into voting for things which might actually harm their own interests.
Now, Bob, show us what your summary of 2016 is. Awakening. Who's been awakened and who's been falling asleep on the job?
Well, I have, for a start. The reason I chose that was because I think, among lots of other people, we went to bed on a couple of occasions this year with huge political events, thinking one thing, believing one thing, and woke up to something completely different. It's been a year of, it's been very difficult to predict outcomes. The pollsters have had a terrifically bad year.
Again.
I mean, presumably they're regrouping and seeing how they can raise their game, because I think it's important. You know, I think it's important that we have an understanding of where we're going, what people are thinking, as Tim has rightly said.
Is it just two fingers up to the establishment, as far as you're concerned, or is it, as Tim's identified this issue of economic, insecurity? People feeling they've been left aside and the politicians just marching on without listening to them?
Well, I don't think there's an easy answer if you look back on it, because if there was, then we would have been able to see what was coming.
But isn't that the problem, Bob? Isn't the really big answer that Western economies are getting relatively poorer as a result of the phenomenal economic growth in the Far East, and that our politicians don't want to admit to the public that the reality is that they can't restore the prosperity of the past, that all of the advantages of the past with which we in our generation became familiar are probably going to be much harder to attain in the future. That's a horrible message for politicians to have to deliver, and so they won't deliver it.
I think that's right. I think also it's been a year where effective campaigning, electoral political campaigning has changed beyond measure. The use of social media, particularly in the American election, but also in the Brexit result as well. I mean, it makes you wonder, doesn't it, if the Scottish referendum had been not in 2015, but this year, how that might have gone if that had been thrown in with the mix as well.
Given the oil price, I suspect the majority in favour of union would have been about 90%.
Well, yeah, but I mean, all the norms in the face. If you look at some of the statistics that were being thrown out by the Remain camp, you know, that were telling us we were going to be poorer, and a lot of us are poorer as a result of the result, even despite an avalanche of information that was coming out that seemed to support the Remain vote, still people were happy to reject it and take a chance.
Well, let's work our way through the main parties and see how you feel they've fared in 2016 and looking ahead to 2017. Obviously, the Conservatives have gone through some fairly severe changes, change of leader, a new Prime Minister, Theresa May. How do you think she's performing, Tim?
I think that the Conservatives' position is one of almost extraordinary good fortune, Paul. They ought to be in crisis. The party is as divided as it's ever been over Europe. It has a new leader who has not yet established herself as having the authority needed to lead the party through the Brexit process. But the Conservative Party faces a profoundly divided set of opposition parties. So it actually has time, which in previous generations I don't think it would have had, to deal with this very complicated issue. It's a government without effective opposition, and that gives Theresa May a phenomenal opportunity to establish herself, and much more time to do so than many of her predecessors would have had.
Bob, we know in Kent the Conservatives are in the ascendancy, and as Tim suggested, look likely to be pretty untroubled by Labour. What about UKIP's possibility of taking support from the Conservatives?
Well, we're obviously keeping an eye on what's happening in South Thanet with the investigation over electoral expenses there. There's some suggestion that that's going to lead to, I mean, Nigel Farage has already said that if there's going to be another election, a by-election there, he will stand. So you could end up sort of having him back in the on the front line of politics.
I'm sure the Conservatives would love that to happen.
But I think Tim's right. Going in terms of the Conservatives, I think that they have an opportunity. But I do think that Theresa May is going to have a problem with party management. She's got an incredibly slender majority in the Commons, and Labour, you know, if they get their act together, will keep throwing the fact that she's an unelected Prime Minister. And I think, you know, there is definitely, in my view, a potential that she will look at the polls, look at the colossal lead that she's got in the polls over Labour, and think, well, you know, it only takes a few more by-elections. I mean, John Major had a bigger majority in 1992, wiped out in the course of a parliament, and you have to govern.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Tim? Because, I mean, we forget she has got a very small majority, but on the other hand, the other parties are kind of split on issues like Europe, so it's tempting to suggest she might want to hang on until...
my instinct is that Theresa May has said she won't call a snap general election, that it would have been very easy for her to do so, that there are a combination of factors which militate against that. One is the one that Bob so accurately identified, the fact that nobody can really trust opinion polls at the moment, and one might fear a nasty surprise. But the other is that there's nobody in her party who wants to replace her. She's got an extraordinarily difficult job, and whilst Boris Johnson may harbour long-term ambitions, I'm sure George Osborne does too. They don't want the job now. The next Conservative Prime Minister wants to be the Prime Minister after Brexit, not the Prime Minister who negotiates it.
And that leads us on to Labour and whether the right leader is the one after the one we've got at the moment in terms of the party's fortunes. How do you assess Labour's performance in 2016? Jeremy Corbyn, you know, confounded all those who thought he'd be dumped as leader, didn't he? And they're claiming that they got a huge increase in members. But out there in the wider community, have they got the support they need in Kent?
But it's interesting with Corbyn because I think because people are seeing what's happening. I mean, everybody's assuming that he's unelectable on the national scale. Everybody's looking at the polls and seeing at 27%, the worst since 1983, and Michael Foot.
25%.
Yeah, I mean, as low as that. And and now people, because of Brexit, because of Trump, because of everything, sort of almost people are voting in almost like a contrary kind of standpoint. Could the same thing? Could there be a sort of groundswell between him if he's going for social justice and he's going to be backing? You know, if they get their act in, I don't see that. I can see momentum pretty much falling apart, which has been sort of obviously the basis of his power base in the Labour Party.
Tim, is Jeremy Corbyn next Prime Minister? Chances of?
I think the chances of Jeremy Corbyn being the next Prime Minister are below zero. I don't think anybody in the Labour Party believes is electable. This is a man who represents an extraordinarily elitist social clique of liberals based in London who care about issues which are almost meaningless to the majority of people who've traditionally voted Labour. This isn't a Labour leader for the industrial working classes or the former industrial labouring classes. It's a Labour Labour leader who believes in the set of issues which are essentially the editorial columns of the New Statesman. I don't think that there is the remotest possibility of Mr Corbyn being elected, and that gives a huge opportunity to his opponents and leaves Britain essentially without an effective parliamentary opposition. It's striking, isn't it, at the moment? The real parliamentary opposition to the Conservatives is being provided by the Scottish National Party. They don't have any seats in England.
And none in Kent either.
I think
unlikely to.
Just following up from that, it's interesting that there's a tranche of Labour that's actually rebuilding itself in the regions. I mean,
but not in Kent. Not in Kent.
You got Sadiq Khan, Labour. They say the most powerful elected Labour politician. Andy Burnham will become mayor of Manchester probably next year, and they're sort of building a regional base. Maybe with which to sort of launch an attack.
But if real votes mean anything, and they mean more than opinion polls, we've just seen a by-election in Lincolnshire where Labour were reduced to coming behind UKIP in a seat in which in the past they came comfortably second to the Conservatives at election after election after election. We've seen an incumbent Conservative government perform better in a by-election than at any time since the late 1970s, and Labour achieving its worst result, as you say, since the nadir of Michael Foot. There is no evidence of recovery in the Labour vote at all.
That's true, isn't it? Because in Kent we've seen various council by-elections. Incredibly, some people would think that Thanet, UKIP-controlled Thanet, would be kind of just about clinging on at best, but actually they've restored their majority, and they've restored their majority in Thanet at the expense of Labour. That's not what the party needs, or...
Well, I mean, I think it's big. I mean, Labour in Kent, it doesn't seem to be moving at all. I mean, you can't see anywhere that it can grow, to the point of 97, when I think, again, that was a year when, I mean, we knew that there was a sort of, the wind was behind Tony Blair's sails, and he just picked up seats in Kent that they never thought they were going to get. They've dropped so low that it's difficult to see where they can rebuild any kind of power base in Kent. You would expect somewhere like Medway, where they could grow, an effective sort of base, but it doesn't seem to be coming across that way.
And once voting habits are broken, they're often very difficult to restore. And remember, it's here in Medway, where we're sitting now, that Mark Reckless won a by-election as a UKIP candidate only 18 months ago against the Labour Party, and was easily able to defeat the Labour candidate there. And I don't think we can see any evidence whatsoever of appeal for Labour in Kent, but I do think that Paul Nuttall, as a new leader of UKIP, might prove to have as much appeal here as his predecessor Nigel Farage.
Well, let's talk about UKIP, because they've lost their talismanic figure in Nigel Farage, but incredibly they are winning small council by-elections. They're still there, still a presence. A canny bit of branding by Paul Nuttall to talk about the People's Patriotic Party, which is a kind of message which will appeal to these kind of disaffected Labour voters, Bob.
Absolutely, and I think if you see where he's pitching his tent, is absolutely on Labour's lawn. I mean, that's where he's going for. He's going for the working class vote. He's putting himself. Well, Nigel Farage, although he said he was anti-establishment, he wasn't, part of that sort of political clique, in London. Actually, Nuttall, is a Liverpudlian, a bit of a bruiser. I think he might actually be able to connect in a lot of ways more effectively than Nigel Farage, admittedly as effective a communicator as Farage was and is. Maybe Nuttall is going to be even more of a threat to Labour in their heartlands.
Tim, what do you think about that?
I think
some people would say, what's the purpose of UKIP now that we've had Brexit?
Well, they seem to have a very clear answer to that. It's to keep Brexit honest and to keep Brexit moving in exactly the right direction. But I think Paul Nuttall has great potential. I think Bob's right. He has to put together what is a very divided party. He has problems with his funding because it's not clear that the funding which backed Farage is prepared to back him. But the message, yes, it appeals to former Labour voters, but it doesn't say anything which isn't equally attractive to those who've defected from the Conservative Party because they are nationalists and because they are hardliners on the European question. These groups work together quite effectively, and if Paul Nuttall can unite them, he becomes a very effective challenger to the Labour Party.
And presumably, Bob, the Conservatives are delighted to see this kind of strategy because it further undermines Labour, doesn't it, if this is where UKIP is going to park its tank?
Well, they wouldn't want to be complacent because they can still cause a lot of trouble over Brexit, and Brexit is going to be the real big headache. Managing that process through, they're committed to March the 29th, or where it is, to trigger Article 50, and there's going to be a battle royal, between now and then, and we're going to still have to wait for the Supreme Court's judgment on that. It's going to be a really tricky period, and UKIP will certainly be, holding their feet to the fire over it in the meantime.
Do either of you two see UKIP actually winning potential parliamentary by-elections in 2017?
I don't think it's inconceivable. I think it will depend on precisely where those by-elections arise, on constituency particulars. But look, the Conservative Party is going to face a real period of difficulty in the new year. It's already clear that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, is determined to have this extended Brexit leaving process where you negotiate the terms but then spend at least another couple of years after you've negotiated those terms implementing them in order to prevent difficulties for business. For UKIP, that looks like a red rag to a bull. It looks like those who opposed to leaving Brexit trying to draw the process out for so long that they end up with something which looks very much like Britain being in the European Union without having formal membership. They're going to warn against that, and a lot of their supporters will be very keen to back them because they still think that leaving the European Union is somehow the magic button which is going to make Britain prosperous. I think that is a forlorn hope, I really do, but UKIP have sold it well before.
Well, let's finally look at the Lib Dems, a party which was reduced to a rump in 2015, but actually showing some signs of kind of life, Bob. Do you think there's an opportunity for them to move into that centre-left ground that Tony Blair exploited quite successfully?
Well, somebody's got to go fill that gap, because it is a vacuum at the moment, the centre-right, centre-left of politics, and it won't be forever. And there is an opportunity. They won the Richmond by-election. Was that much of a surprise? The Tories didn't stand, and then they framed it very cleverly into a Brexit rather than a Heathrow debate. That was a clever bit of campaigning. But you mentioned Tony Blair. Now, is he going to re-emerge as a figure in politics? He's setting up this. He's not calling it a think tank, some sort of policy body.
Given what's happened in 2016, who would be surprised if he did?
Well, you say. I mean, the Chilcot report. I mean, for 7 years, £10 million inquiry. What's it actually achieved? All of that. And although he was slated, he had to, and he did that memorable speech, didn't he? On the day of that we were sort of gripped by. It's actually one of the forgotten moments in the era of politics. His, almost as a cathartic.
Let's bring Tim in because we're running short of time. But good year for Lib Dems ahead, do you think? Or,
The Liberal Democrats have proved that they can win seats which they have held for most of the time since the Second World War, so they have revealed that there is still life in the corpse. I think that they will become a repository for votes in constituencies where people are determined to continue to oppose Brexit. So if you are a real committed pro-European, the Liberal Democrats are the place to go to. They are the home for your vote. But I think that's a small minority of the British population. They're alive again, but they're not thriving.
Well, that's unfortunately all we've got time for on this show. Thanks to our guests for coming in. We could have carried on discussing that for quite a long time, I think. But we'll be back in the new year, and who knows what's in store in 2017. In the meantime, you can catch up on all the latest political news in Kent by logging on to kentonline.co.uk or listening to KMFM. Thanks for watching.